Simple question. When your hand meets a table, what happens? Everyone answers. They touch. Contact occurs, but push deeper. What does touch mean? That surfaces unite, that boundaries meet, that matter contacts matter. Now ask. If contact occurs, what prevents your hand from passing through? The table is solid, you answer. But what makes it solid? Because I cannot pass through it. And why can't you pass through? Because it's solid. The reasoning travels in a circle. You have explained nothing, merely restated the phenomenon in different words. So ask again. What actually creates the resistance you feel? What mechanism prevents penetration? And here is where it becomes strange. Because as your hand approaches the table, forces begin to act before any contact could occur. The closer you approach, the stronger the resistance. Not suddenly at some threshold, but continuously as distance shrinks. Which means forces act across space. Which means they don't require touching to operate. Which means the resistance preventing contact arises before contact could happen. Which means contact never happens at all. Whence it follows that every interaction you've ever experienced, every sensation of touching, is forces meeting forces across invisible distance, not surfaces meeting surfaces, forces across distance, always. And if that's true, then what is matter? What are you? What have you been doing your entire life? You think you've touched something today, your hand upon a surface, your feet upon the floor, the chair supporting your weight at this very moment. You're wrong. Not a little wrong. Fundamentally wrong about what's actually happening. Place your hand flat upon a table right now. Feel that sensation, the resistance, the pressure, the undeniable experience of contact. Everyone agrees on what they feel. The sensation is immediate, certain, absolutely convincing. But what if this sensation, however real it feels, is not revealing what you think it reveals? Here is the problem. You feel resistance, and you interpret this as contact between surfaces. Your skin meeting wood. Two boundaries united. Matter touching matter. This interpretation seems so obvious, so direct, that questioning it appears absurd. But the error most make is believing that sensation reports mechanism. It does not. Consider what's actually occurring when you press your hand upon that table. Your nervous system detects force acting upon the skin. Nerve endings respond to this force. They send signals to your brain. Your brain translates these signals into the experience you call touch. The translation is accurate. Force is indeed present. But the interpretation is false. You feel force. You interpret contact. These are not the same thing. Now push harder against the table. The sensation intensifies. More pressure, stronger resistance. The feeling of touching becomes more pronounced. But examine this more carefully. What changed? If contact were already established, if your skin were already meeting the table's surface, why would increased pressure create increased sensation? The surfaces would already be united. Yet the sensation grows proportionally with force applied. This proportional relationship reveals something crucial. Sensation is reporting force, not contact. The harder you push, the more force acts upon your skin, the stronger the signal to your brain. Whence it follows that what you experience as touching more firmly is actually detecting greater force. The mechanism is force detection. The interpretation is contact. But force can exist without contact. Indeed, force is precisely what prevents contact from occurring. You have spent your entire life feeling resistance and automatically concluding, I am touching this object. This conclusion happens so quickly, so reflexively, that you never questioned it. Why would you? The sensation feels direct. It feels like immediate knowledge of the world. But sensation is not knowledge of mechanism. Sensation is merely the detection of effects. Think of it this way. Your eyes show you the sun moving across the sky. You see it rise in the east, arc overhead, set in the west. The sensation is undeniable. Every culture throughout history witnessed this movement, yet the interpretation that the sun orbits Earth is precisely backwards. Earth rotates whilst the sun remains relatively fixed. The sensation was accurate. The interpretation was false. The same principle operates here. The sensation of touching is accurate. Force is acting upon your skin. But the interpretation that this force indicates contact is false. Sensation reports that something is happening. It does not, cannot, reveal the mechanism creating what happens. Your nervous system evolved to detect forces useful for survival. A creature that could distinguish safe surfaces from dangerous ones survived to reproduce. A creature that could feel when something was pushing against it could respond appropriately. Natural selection refined this capacity over countless generations. But evolution optimized detection for survival, not for revealing mechanical truth. Your nervous system is a tool for navigating the world, not a microscope revealing how matter interacts. Consider when you grip an object, a cup, a tool, this very page. Notice the sensation in your fingers. You interpret this as holding something through contact. Your fingers meet the object's surface, matter touching matter. You possess it through direct contact. This is what the sensation seems to tell you. Now grip more firmly. Squeeze harder. The sensation intensifies. Your fingers feel more pressure. The grip feels tighter. But what actually changed? Not contact. You were already holding the object. Contact, if it existed, was already established. What changed is force. Your muscles exerted greater force. The object's structure resisted with greater force. The increased sensation reports increased force, not increased contact. The same pattern operates everywhere. When you sit, you feel your body meeting the chair, but push yourself deeper into the seat. The sensation changes, pressure increases. Yet if contact were already established, why would the sensation change? The force changed. The contact interpretation is misleading you. Stand and walk across the room. Each step creates sensation, your foot touching the floor. But notice how the sensation varies. Step lightly, and you feel slight contact. Stamp your foot down hard, and you feel powerful contact. The force varies. The sensation varies with it. But if contact is simply present or absent, if surfaces either meet or don't meet, why does the intensity vary continuously? Because you're detecting force, not contact. And force varies in magnitude. Lean against a wall with your shoulder. Feel the sensation. Now push harder. The feeling intensifies. Same wall, same shoulder, same location. But the sensation grows stronger as you apply more force. This proves sensation tracks force, not contact. Here is what you must understand. Every sensory experience you call touch is force detection, not contact verification. Your hand does not send signals saying, I am contacting this surface. Your hand sends signals saying, I am experiencing force. Your brain interprets this force as contact. The interpretation is automatic, unconscious, and wrong. This is not philosophical abstraction. This is not word games. This is the distinction between what you feel and what actually occurs. The sensation of touching is real. You genuinely experience something. But what you experience is force acting upon nerve endings. What you conclude from this experience is that surfaces have made contact. The conclusion does not follow from the evidence. You cannot change what your nerves report. When force acts upon skin, nerves respond. This is biology. But you can change what you conclude from those reports. You can recognize that feeling resistance means force is present, nothing more. The automatic leap from "I feel force" to "surfaces are contacting" is an interpretation you have been making your entire life without realizing you were interpreting anything at all. This recognition creates the first crack in certainty. You begin to distinguish between what you feel and what might actually be occurring. The sensation remains unchanged. Touch still feels like touching, but doubt has entered. Perhaps the obvious interpretation is not the true one. Perhaps what seems most direct is actually most deceptive. After all, the most convincing illusions are those you never think to question. The child stands before a wall and pushes. The wall does not yield. The child pushes harder. Still no movement. The child concludes, the wall is solid. Ask the child why they cannot pass through the wall. Because it's solid, they answer with certainty. The explanation feels complete. The question appears answered. But watch what happens when you push further. What makes the wall solid, you ask? The child pauses. They have not considered this question. The material it's made from, they finally answer. Bricks and mortar, these are solid things. But what about bricks and mortar makes them solid? You continue. Now confusion enters the child's face. They struggle for words. Eventually, they're solid. They're made of solid stuff. The reasoning has travelled in a circle. The wall is solid because it's made of solid materials. The materials are solid because they're solid. The circle has closed. The explanation has returned to the starting point without revealing anything about mechanism. You have witnessed circular reasoning disguised as understanding. Most adults never escape this pattern. They feel resistance and call it solidity, believing they have explained something. But solid is merely another name for resists penetration, whence it follows that saying it resists because it's solid is saying it resists because it resists. This explains nothing. It restates the observation in different words, whilst concealing complete ignorance of what creates resistance. Listen to how people explain everyday phenomena. Why can't I push my hand through this table? Someone asks. Because the table is solid, comes the confident answer. Push further. What creates this solidity? The answer, the atomic structure, the molecular bonds, the material properties. These words sound sophisticated. They feel like knowledge. But examine them more carefully. What about the molecular bonds prevents your hand from passing through? You ask. The answer, if you trace it far enough, returns to, they make it solid. The circle closes again. Different words, same emptiness. The sophisticated vocabulary conceals that nothing has been explained. Or consider this exchange. Why do things fall? Gravity. What is gravity? The force that makes things fall. The reasoning circles back perfectly. Gravity explains falling. Falling defines gravity. The explanation explains nothing. It merely names the phenomenon twice using different words. This is the restatement illusion, circular reasoning's primary weapon. It works by restating the phenomenon in different terms and calling this an explanation. Why does this resist? Because it's solid. Solid simply means resists. You have explained nothing, merely renamed the observation. But because the rename uses more impressive language, it creates the feeling of understanding. People feel they comprehend something because they can name it. But naming is not explaining. A label is not a mechanism. You can call resistance solidity, or structural integrity, or electromagnetic repulsion between electron clouds. Each label sounds more sophisticated than the last, but unless you understand what these words describe mechanically, you have merely substituted impressive names for simple names. The test is this: can you describe the mechanism, what actually creates the effect, without using the effect itself as explanation? If not, you are reasoning in circles. Watch for this pattern everywhere. Why is water wet? Because of its molecular properties. What about those properties creates wetness? They make the water wet. Circle closed. Why do magnets attract? Magnetic force. What is magnetic force? The force that makes magnets attract. Circle closed. Why is ice cold? Because it's at a low temperature. What is low temperature? When things are cold. Circle closed. The pattern pervades casual understanding. It conceals itself beneath technical vocabulary. People use words like molecular, electromagnetic, quantum, structural. Each sounds authoritative. Each suggests deep knowledge. But if you cannot explain what these terms describe mechanically, you are simply using sophisticated labels for mysterious phenomena. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The child who cannot explain why walls are impenetrable grows into an adult who cannot explain it either. But the adult has learned impressive vocabulary: atomic bonds, electron clouds, Pauli exclusion principle that conceals the same ignorance the child possessed. The words have changed. The circular reasoning persists. The inability to explain mechanism remains. Most people never advance beyond childhood's confusion. They merely disguise it better. Now consider what this means for understanding touch. When you ask someone why they cannot push their hand through a table, they might answer, because matter cannot interpenetrate. This sounds like an explanation. But what does matter cannot interpenetrate mean? It means matter resists passing through itself, which is precisely what you are trying to explain. The answer is circular. Or they might say, because of electromagnetic repulsion between electron clouds. This sounds much more sophisticated. It uses technical terms. It references electrons. But unless they can explain how electrons create repulsion and why this repulsion prevents interpenetration without simply saying electrons repel and therefore surfaces resist, they are still reasoning in circles. The technical vocabulary obscures the circular path. True explanation reveals mechanism distinct from the phenomenon itself. It shows you what creates the effect you observe. Circular reasoning merely returns to the phenomenon using different words. It describes rather than reveals. It labels rather than explains. And this matters profoundly because you cannot achieve true understanding whilst clinging to false understanding. The comfortable illusion that you comprehend something simply because you can name it or describe it in sophisticated terms prevents genuine inquiry. Why investigate something you believe you already understand? The circular reasoning must be exposed and abandoned. Only then can genuine questions emerge. Not, why is it solid? But, what mechanism creates resistance? Not, what makes it impenetrable? But, what forces prevent interpenetration? These questions demand answers beyond naming. They demand revelation of mechanism. The discomfort you feel when recognizing circular reasoning in your own explanations is necessary discomfort. It reveals how much you thought you understood, but actually don't. This revelation is uncomfortable. It disrupts confidence. It exposes ignorance, hiding beneath impressive words. But this exposure is not defeat. It is the beginning of genuine understanding. You cannot build true comprehension upon false foundations. The circular reasoning must dissolve before wisdom can emerge. The impressive words must be set aside until you can fill them with actual mechanical understanding. The comfortable illusion of knowing must be abandoned before you can truly know. So when you feel resistance and think solid, pause. Recognize that solid is a label, not an explanation. When you hear electromagnetic repulsion, ask what mechanism this phrase describes. When you encounter sophisticated vocabulary, test whether it reveals or merely restates. The path to understanding requires recognizing when you don't understand. And most people, on most topics, don't understand nearly as much as they believe they do. They have names, they have labels, they have circular explanations that feel like understanding, but they have not grasped mechanism. The error has been exposed. The circular reasoning has been revealed. The false certainty has cracked. Now comes the harder work, establishing what actually occurs when surfaces approach each other. What principle governs these interactions? What mechanism creates resistance? You have recognized the problem. Sensation misleads, and common reasoning travels in circles. But recognizing false understanding is not yet achieving true understanding. The illusion has dissolved. Now the truth must be established through careful observation of phenomena. What happens actually happens when you push against something. Push against a wall with your hand. Feel the resistance. The wall pushes back against you. But how hard does it push? Here is what you must observe carefully. The wall pushes back with exactly the same force you apply. Precisely. Perfectly. Not approximately the same. Exactly the same. Push gently. The resistance is slight. Push harder. The resistance grows stronger. Push with all your strength. The resistance matches you exactly. This is not coincidence. This is not approximation. This is perfect balance, occurring at every moment, at every level of force. This is the fundamental principle that explains all interactions. Every force produces an equal and opposite force simultaneously, not similar forces, not forces that balance out eventually. Equal forces, opposite in direction, simultaneous in occurrence. This precision is not accidental. It reveals something essential about how forces operate in nature. Watch this principle in action. Place both hands against a wall. Push gently with your left hand alone. Feel the slight resistance. Now push with both hands, doubling the force. The resistance doubles. Add a third person pushing beside you, tripling the total force. The resistance triples. The relationship is immediate and proportional. The wall matches whatever force you apply, instantly and exactly. If the wall possessed fixed resistance independent of your force, this proportional relationship could not exist. Eventually, sufficient force would overcome the wall's resistance. You would break through. But at levels short of structural failure, the resistance always matches applied force precisely. This demonstrates that the interaction creates both forces simultaneously in perfect proportion. Most people think, I push, therefore the wall resists. This suggests sequence, action followed by reaction. But examine more carefully. When does the resistance arise? The instant you push, not a fraction of a second later, not after your force reaches the wall and the wall responds simultaneously with your pushing. This simultaneity reveals something profound. The forces are not two events, but one event viewed from two perspectives. Your hand pushing the wall and the wall pushing your hand are aspects of a single interaction. The interaction creates both forces at once. Neither exists independent of the other. You cannot push without resistance arising. The resistance does not follow your action. It accompanies it, matched perfectly. This is why the equality is exact, rather than approximate. If the forces were separate events, your push causing the wall's resistance, some delay would exist, however small. Some variation would occur, but the forces arise together because they are generated by the interaction itself, not by objects responding to each other. Consider what this means. When you push against anything, you are not overcoming its resistance through force. You are creating an interaction that generates equal opposing forces simultaneously. The harder you push, the stronger both forces become. You and the surface are not in a contest where sufficient force overcomes resistance. You are participants in an interaction that maintains perfect balance at whatever level of force you apply. Now observe this principle in motion. Stand and take a step forward. When you walk, your foot pushes backward against the ground. What happens? The ground pushes forward against your foot with exactly equal force. This forward force from the ground propels you. Without it, walking would be impossible. If the forces were not exactly equal, walking would fail in one of two ways. If the ground pushed forward less strongly than your foot pushed backward, your foot would slip backward. If the ground pushed forward more strongly, you would be launched forward uncontrollably. But forces balance exactly, creating stable, controlled motion. Every step demonstrates this principle operating in perfect precision. You experience it constantly without recognizing it. Or consider lifting an object. You grasp it and lift upward with sufficient force to raise it. But what creates sufficient force? Your lifting force must exactly balance the attractive force pulling the object earthward, plus slightly more to accelerate it upward. The object's weight, the attractive force acting upon it, determines how much force you must exert. The forces relate precisely. This principle operates universally, at every scale, in every interaction. An apple hanging from a branch. The branch pulls upward with exactly the force needed to balance the attractive force pulling the apple downward. Equal forces, opposite directions, simultaneous occurrence. The apple remains suspended through perfect balance. A book resting on a table. Attractive force pulls it downward. The table's surface resists upward with exactly equal force. Perfect equilibrium. The book neither rises nor falls because forces balance exactly. The moon orbiting Earth. Attractive force pulls the moon toward Earth. The moon's motion creates outward force. These forces balance exactly. Were they not equal, the moon would either spiral inward or fly away. But the orbit persists through perfect equilibrium. From the intimate to the cosmic, from the stationary to the moving, every interaction demonstrates forces arising in equal opposition. This is not multiple principles for different situations. This is one principle operating everywhere. But here is what makes this principle crucial for understanding touch. If forces always arise in equal opposition, and if they arise simultaneously rather than sequentially, then the forces cannot be created by surfaces contacting each other. Contact would suggest surfaces meeting, then responding, but the forces arise together before any contact could occur. Push your hand slowly toward a table. As the distance decreases, begin feeling for resistance. You will notice resistance growing as you approach, not suddenly at some threshold, but gradually as proximity increases. The resistance is already present before what you would call contact occurs. It strengthens as distance shrinks. This reveals that forces act across distance, not through contact. As your hand approaches the table, forces begin interacting before surfaces could meet. The interaction creates both forces, your hand pushing forward, the table resisting backward, in perfect balance, and this balance grows stronger as distance decreases. Push harder, compressing the gap further. The resistance increases proportionally, but the forces remain exactly equal. You cannot push through because for every increase in your force, resistance increases equally. The balance maintains itself at progressively smaller distances. This is why you cannot overcome resistance through force alone. Force maintains the balance. Applying more force simply creates more resistance in exact proportion. The equality persists regardless of magnitude. You push with 10 pounds of force, 10 pounds of resistance arises. You push with 100 pounds, 100 pounds of resistance arises. You push with 1,000 pounds, 1,000 pounds of resistance arises. The ratio remains 1-to-1, perfect equality at every level, whence it follows that the resistance you experience is not a surface somehow knowing how hard to push back. It is the interaction creating both forces simultaneously. The mechanism is fundamental. The principle is universal. Every force produces an equal and opposite force simultaneously. This is not theory. This is not speculation. This is observable, demonstrable, verifiable fact. You can test it right now. Push against anything. Vary your force. Observe the perfect proportional response. The principle reveals itself directly to careful observation. And this principle, simple as it appears, transforms everything that follows. Because if forces arise in perfect opposition without contact, then what creates the sensation of touching? If forces balance exactly at every level, why does increased force feel like touching harder? If the interaction maintains equilibrium automatically, what prevents your hand from passing through the table? The principle has been established through careful observation. Forces act across distance. They arise in equal and opposite pairs. They strengthen as proximity increases. These are not speculations, but demonstrated facts. But this raises urgent questions. What are these forces? Why do they increase with proximity rather than remaining constant? What mechanism creates repulsion between surfaces? And most crucially, if forces alone prevent interpenetration, what is matter itself? The foundations have been laid. Now comes deeper inquiry into mechanism and structure. You now understand that forces balance in perfect opposition. But this creates an immediate question. Why can't you overcome resistance through greater force? After all, if you push hard enough, shouldn't you break through eventually? If sufficient force were applied, wouldn't contact finally occur? Everyone knows that enough pressure breaks things. Enough force penetrates. So why does this same logic not allow contact? Here is the answer. You cannot achieve contact through force because force itself maintains the separation. This is the profound paradox at the heart of matter. Force seems like it should overcome resistance. Apply enough force, and surely you cross any boundary. But examine what actually occurs when you increase force against a surface. Press your palms together lightly. Feel the slight resistance. Now press harder. The resistance increases. Press with maximum strength. The resistance increases further. Throughout this entire progression, what changes? The force you apply grows, and the opposing force grows proportionally. At no point does resistance reach a ceiling. At no point does one hand suddenly pass through the other. Instead, opposition increases without limit as applied force increases. This proportional relationship proves something crucial. The gap persists. If contact occurred at some threshold of force, resistance would reach that threshold and cease increasing. you would cross the boundary. Contact would be established, but resistance continues growing endlessly with applied force. You compress the gap to smaller and smaller scales, but forces strengthen proportionally to prevent its elimination. Here is what you must understand. The mechanism preventing contact is force. The mechanism you employ to attempt achieving contact is also force. Therefore, attempting contact through force is using the barrier to overcome the barrier. It cannot succeed. Push harder against a surface and repulsion strengthens. The boundary you seek to eliminate is preserved by the very thing you use to eliminate it. This is not limitation in the sense of insufficient strength. This is impossibility rooted in the nature of force itself. Consider what this means mechanically. As your hand approaches a table, forces begin to act between them. These forces are repulsive. They push the hand and table apart. As distance decreases, repulsive force increases. Push your hand closer, and the opposition grows stronger. Now, apply additional force to compress the gap further. What happens? Repulsive force increases proportionally. The gap compresses. Yes, the distance becomes smaller, but the forces maintaining that smaller gap grow stronger. You achieve compression without elimination. Think of it this way. At large distances, small forces maintain separation. At smaller distances, larger forces maintain separation. At extremely small distances, extremely large forces maintain separation. The gap persists at every scale, with forces growing more powerful as the gap compresses. This is why pressing your hands together with maximum strength doesn't cause them to merge. The gap at maximum force is smaller than the gap at gentle force, but it is maintained more powerfully. Forces strengthen faster than distance decreases. The same principle operates when attempting to push through any surface. Hammer a nail into wood. Each strike applies enormous force. The nail penetrates deeper, but does it achieve contact with the wood? No. It compresses gaps at each stage, whilst forces maintain separation throughout. The nail advances by overwhelming resistance progressively, compressing the configuration of wood structure whilst never eliminating the distances within it. Or consider pressing clay. Apply force, and the clay deforms. It yields. It appears to offer no resistance, but examine more carefully. The clay deforms by internal forces rearranging whilst maintaining separation between elements. Push your finger into clay and you rearrange the configuration of its structure. But the elements never contact each other. They shift position whilst forces maintain distance throughout. Even in materials that seem to yield completely, soft materials that deform easily, you witness compression without contact. Forces rearrange their configuration but maintain distance at every scale. Structure persists through force, never despite it. Now perform a thought experiment. Imagine forces vanished completely, not reduced, eliminated entirely. What would occur? Without repulsive forces maintaining separation, elements would rush together. Your hand would interpenetrate the table without resistance. But more profoundly, your hand would collapse inward as internal forces vanished. The table would collapse. Your entire body would collapse. Every structure would simultaneously fail. Why? Because structure depends entirely on forces maintaining distance. Remove those forces, and nothing prevents elements from occupying the same space. The configuration that creates your hand, elements held in stable relation by forces across distance, would cease to exist. The elements would fall inward without opposition. This thought experiment reveals that force maintaining distance is not a barrier preventing contact. Force maintaining distance is the mechanism creating structure. Remove the barrier and structure fails. The separation is essential, not incidental. It is not something to overcome, but something that enables existence itself. Whence it follows that the impossibility of contact is not a limitation to overcome, but a feature enabling structure. Without forces maintaining distance, matter, as you experience it, could not exist. The gap you cannot eliminate is the gap that makes your hand exist as a hand. The separation you cannot cross is the separation that creates every surface, every boundary, every structure. This shifts the question entirely. You began wondering why sufficient force cannot achieve contact. Now you recognize that if contact were possible, structure would be impossible. The two are mutually exclusive. You can have a universe where forces maintain distance and structure exists, or you can have a universe where contact is possible and structure fails. You cannot have both. You live in the first universe. The impossibility of contact is the condition of your existence. But recognizing this raises an even deeper question. What is matter? If bodies are not continuous solid, if forces maintain separation even within structures, then what are objects? What are you? The answer transforms everything. Look at the table before you. It appears solid, continuous, substantial, a unified piece of matter occupying space. But this appearance conceals the truth. The table is not solid. It is mostly empty space. This sounds absurd. You can see the table. You can touch it. Or rather, you experience forces when your hand approaches it. It resists. It supports objects placed upon it. How could something so evidently solid consist mostly of space? Here is the answer. What you perceive as solid is actually structure maintained by forces across internal distances. Consider a woven fabric. From across a room, it appears continuous, a solid piece of material. But examine it closely. You see threads. Between the threads exists space. Look closer at a single thread. It consists of fibers twisted together. Between the fibers exists space. At every scale, what seemed continuous reveals itself as elements held in relation with space between them. Matter operates through the same principle. The table seems continuous solid when viewed at ordinary scales, but its structure consists of elements held in configuration by forces across distances too small to perceive directly. The apparent solidity you experience is not continuity. It is forces maintaining elements in stable relation. What you call solid is elements held in rigid configuration by forces so strong that rearrangement requires enormous energy. The forces prevent elements from collapsing together. They maintain distance between elements, and this distance maintained by force creates the resistance you interpret as solidity. Remove those forces, and the apparent solidity vanishes. The structure collapses. The table ceases being a table. Solidity is not an inherent property of matter. Solidity is an emergent property of forces in opposition. Structure, not substance. Configuration, maintained by forces across distance. This truth operates at every scale. The elements comprising the table, called the molecules, are separated by distances maintained by forces. The constituents of those molecules are separated by forces. At every level, you find the same pattern. Elements held in relation by forces across space. The space doesn't disappear as you examine smaller scales. It persists. What changes is not the presence of space, but the magnitude of forces maintaining it. The smaller the scale, the more powerful the forces preventing collapse. But distance remains at every level. Now, recognize that this applies to every object you encounter. the chair you sit upon, structure maintained by forces across internal distances, the floor beneath your feet, configuration held stable by forces across space, the walls surrounding you, elements in relation, separated by distances maintained through force. And this applies to your own body. You are not continuous substance. You are structure maintained by forces across internal distances. The sensation of possessing substance, of occupying space, of having boundaries, all emerge from forces in opposition within your structure. You exist as configuration across distance. Your hand is not one unified piece. It is elements, cells, molecules, smaller constituents, held in configuration by internal forces preventing collapse. The solidity you feel when you make a fist is forces balanced in opposition throughout the structure. Remove those forces, and your hand would cease existing as a hand. The same pattern operates throughout your body. Forces maintain the configuration that creates your form. You are not solid in the way naive understanding suggests. You are structure held stable through perpetual balanced opposition across internal distances. This recognition transforms what it means to exist physically. You are not a unified solid moving through space. You are a configuration of elements held in relation by forces, navigating through a world of other configurations similarly maintained. When your hand approaches a table, it is structure approaching structure. Configuration interacting with configuration. Forces meeting forces. Now consider different states of matter, solid, fluid, gas, in light of this understanding. What differs between these states is not the presence or absence of space. Space exists throughout. What differs is the rigidity of configuration. Take ice, water in solid form. The elements are held in rigid configuration by strong forces. The structure resists rearrangement. You experience this as hardness, solidity. But the elements are separated by distances maintained through force. The solidity is configuration, not continuity. Melt the ice. Forces weaken. The rigid configuration loosens into fluid. Elements can slide past each other while still maintaining separation. The structure flows because forces permit rearrangement whilst preventing interpenetration. Water is not less real than ice. It is differently configured. Heat the water to steam. Forces weaken further. Configuration loosens dramatically. Elements separate widely while still maintaining distance from each other. Gas is not absence of structure. It is structure in maximal looseness. Elements in minimal configuration whilst forces continue preventing actual contact. Throughout these transformations, elements never touch. Only the rigidity of configuration changes. From rigid solid to flowing fluid to dispersed gas, the principle persists. Forces across distance create structure. The pattern remains constant, whilst the specific configuration varies. Or consider compressing a sponge. It yields easily because its internal structure has space permitting compression, but compress it fully and it resists. Why? Because forces within the compressed structure balance the force you apply. The sponge is mostly space held in flexible configuration. Compress it, and you rearrange the configuration whilst forces continue preventing collapse. The same principle explains why some materials feel hard and others soft. Hard materials have rigid configurations maintained by powerful forces. Soft materials have flexible configurations with weaker forces permitting easy rearrangement. But both are structure maintained across distance. Both are configuration, not continuous substance. Whence it follows that every object you encounter, every surface, every material, every body, is structure maintained by forces across internal distances. The diversity of materials emerges from diversity of configuration, not from different fundamental natures. Wood and steel and water and air all operate through the same principle. Forces maintaining distance create structure. The table resisting your hand does so through forces maintaining configuration across internal distances. Your hand approaching it is structure, approaching structure. When you experience resistance, you are detecting forces in your hand's structure, meeting forces in the table's structure. The sensation emerges from structure interacting with structure across the gap between them. You are structure held stable through perpetual balanced opposition. You exist as configuration. You are forces in balance. This is not less real than imagined continuous substance. This is more magnificent because it reveals how precise, how exquisite the balance must be for you to exist at all. Every moment of your existence depends on forces maintaining distance throughout your structure. Every object you encounter exists through the same mechanism. The solid world has revealed itself as space held in relation by forces. Structure, not substance. Configuration, maintained with perfect precision. And now you understand. If this mechanism operates between your hand and the table, and within each structure, then this same principle must govern all interactions. Individual insights must integrate into coherent understanding. The pieces must assemble into unified vision. Everything connects through one principle. Now, we must see how. You have learned that forces prevent contact. You have discovered that matter is structure maintained across distance. You have recognized that solidity is configuration, not substance. But now observe something more profound. These are not separate insights. They are aspects of a single truth operating everywhere. One principle governs all interactions, from the intimate to the cosmic, from the stationary to the moving, from attractive forces to repulsive forces. The mechanism is universal. Consider an apple falling from a tree. Attractive force pulls it toward earth. You observe this daily. You call it gravity. The apple accelerates downward until it approaches the ground. Then what occurs? Just before impact, repulsive forces arise. The same forces that prevent your hand from passing through a table now prevent the apple from passing through earth. Attractive force pulls downward. Repulsive force pushes upward. The forces meet, they balance. Equilibrium is established across an infinitesimal gap. The apple does not touch the ground. Forces balance at immeasurably small separation. The apple comes to rest through force equilibrium, not through contact. Now look upward to the moon. It orbits Earth in perpetual circuit. What maintains this orbit? Attractive force pulls the moon toward Earth. Were this force unopposed, the moon would fall inward, but the moon's motion creates outward tendency. Attractive force balanced by motion. The moon neither falls to Earth nor escapes to space, because forces maintain perfect equilibrium. Same principle, different configuration. The apple and ground. Attractive force balanced by repulsive force at infinitesimal distance. The moon and Earth. Attractive force balanced by motion across vast distance. Both demonstrate forces across distance, creating equilibrium. The scales differ dramatically. The specific forces vary, but the mechanism remains constant. Distance, interaction. Balanced opposition. Contact prevented. Nature uses one principle everywhere. This reveals something extraordinary. Attractive and repulsive forces both operate through distance. They both create equilibrium through opposition. They both prevent contact whilst enabling interaction. The universe does not use different principles for different types of force. It uses one principle manifesting through different configurations. When you stand, forces balance. Weight pushes downward. Attractive force acting upon your body. The floor resists upward. Repulsive force preventing interpenetration. Equilibrium. You remain stationary through balanced opposition across imperceptible distance. When you walk, equilibrium transfers. Each step shifts from one balance point to another. Your foot pushes backward against ground. Ground pushes forward against foot with equal force. This forward force propels you. Meanwhile, weight downward balances with resistance upward at each point. Walking is transition between equilibriums, not violation of principle. When you hold an object, forces balance. Attractive force pulls the object earthward. Forces in your hand resist downward motion without contacting the object. You surround it at distance, creating upward force sufficient to oppose attraction. The object remains suspended through force equilibrium. When celestial bodies orbit, forces balance. Attractive force prevents escape. Motion prevents inward fall. Perfect equilibrium maintained across vast emptiness. Every orbit demonstrates the same principle your hand demonstrates when approaching a table. Forces across distance creating stability through opposition. The pattern repeats endlessly at every scale. A book resting on a table. Attractive force downward, repulsive force upward, equilibrium established. A bridge supporting weight. Attractive force on the structure balanced by internal forces maintaining configuration. A bird in flight. Attractive force downward, balanced by air resistance and wing force upward. Everywhere you observe stability, you witness equilibrium. Everywhere you observe motion, you witness transition between equilibriums. Everywhere you observe structure, you witness forces maintaining distance. The principle is not imposed from outside. It is how forces inherently relate to each other. But here is what makes this unity profound. If one principle governs all interactions, then the universe operates as a single, coherent system, not a collection of unrelated mechanisms, not different laws for different phenomena. One law, manifesting infinitely. The moon orbiting Earth and your hand approaching a table are not fundamentally different events. They are the same event at different scales with different specific forces. Distance interaction, creating equilibrium through balanced opposition. Contact prevented whilst interaction enabled. This means that when you experience resistance approaching a surface, you are experiencing the same fundamental mechanism that maintains planetary orbits. The forces differ in type and magnitude. The distances differ dramatically, but the principle operates identically. You participate in cosmic law every moment. Consider a pendulum swinging. At the bottom of its arc, forces balance perfectly. Attractive force pulls downward. Tension in the string pulls upward. Equal forces. Opposite directions. The pendulum reaches maximum speed at this point of perfect equilibrium. Then it swings upward, forces gradually shifting out of balance until it reaches the apex where motion stops and reversal begins. Throughout the swing, you witness forces in perpetual relation, never contacting, always interacting across distance, creating motion through imbalance, creating stability through balance. The pendulum does not swing because parts contact each other. It swings because forces act across distance according to universal principle. Or observe fluid flowing. Water moves through a channel, navigating obstacles, finding paths. What creates this motion? Forces in relation. Attractive force pulls it downward. Forces within the fluid resist compression whilst permitting flow. Forces between fluid and channel prevent interpenetration whilst allowing movement. Distance interaction throughout. The fluid does not touch the channel any more than your hand touches a table. Forces maintain separation whilst creating the appearance and function of contact. The flow demonstrates forces in perpetual interaction across maintained distances, whence it follows that the universe functions as fields of force in perpetual interaction, not objects bumping into each other like solid balls, not surfaces making contact and rebounding, forces acting across space, creating every phenomenon through endless variation on one theme. Attraction and repulsion both operate through distance, structure and motion. Both emerge from force relationships, rest and activity. Both demonstrate equilibrium at different configurations. The diversity is real. The unity is deeper. This is not reductionism making everything really the same. The phenomena differ genuinely. An apple falling and the moon orbiting are distinct experiences, but both emerge from the same underlying principle. The unity does not erase diversity. It reveals the elegant simplicity beneath apparent complexity. You can now see reality as a unified system. Every interaction, from the most intimate to the most cosmic, demonstrates forces across distance in relation. Contact was always illusion. Distance was always reality. And this distance, maintained by forces in exquisite balance, creates every structure, every stability, every sensation you experience. The scattered pieces have assembled. The pattern has emerged. Understanding has achieved coherence. One principle governs all. The complexity was appearance. The unity was always present, waiting for careful observation to reveal it. But grasping principle intellectually is not yet experiencing it directly. Knowledge is not yet vision. Understanding mechanism does not automatically transform how you perceive each moment. The final integration requires something more, bringing understanding to bear on direct experience until recognition becomes automatic. Now comes the question of how knowledge transforms perception. You now understand that forces act across distance without contact. You know that matter is structure maintained by force. You recognize that one principle governs all interactions, but understanding and experiencing are not the same thing. Place your hand on a table right now. The sensation is identical to what you felt at the beginning of this journey. Resistance, pressure, the experience of touching solid surface. Nothing has changed in what you feel. Everything has changed in what you understand about what you feel. This is the distinction between knowing and seeing, between intellectual comprehension and integrated wisdom, between understanding mechanism and directly perceiving mechanism in each moment. The sensation of touching will never change. Your nervous system will always detect force and translate it into the experience you call touch. This is biology. This is how your body interfaces with the world. But what you conclude from this sensation, what you recognize to be occurring, can transform completely. Previously, you felt resistance and automatically concluded, I am touching this surface. My hand meets the table. Contact occurs. This conclusion happened instantly, unconsciously, without reflection. The sensation triggered the interpretation reflexively. Now, feeling the same sensation, you can recognize forces in my hand repel forces in the table across infinitesimal distance. The gap persists. The resistance I feel is balanced opposition maintaining separation. Same sensation, different understanding. This is perception transformed by comprehension. But this transformation does not happen automatically. Intellectual understanding precedes experiential integration. You grasp the concept before experiencing it directly. The gap between knowing and seeing must be bridged through practice, repeatedly bringing understanding to bear on sensation until recognition becomes automatic. Consider someone learning that Earth rotates whilst the sun remains relatively fixed. Initially, they grasp this intellectually. They understand the mechanism. But when they look at the sky, the sun still appears to move. The visual experience remains unchanged. Only gradually, through repeatedly reminding themselves of the true mechanism whilst observing the apparent motion, does their interpretation shift. Eventually, they look at the sky and spontaneously recognize, Earth is rotating beneath my feet. The sensation hasn't changed. The automatic recognition has. The same process operates here. Initially, you must deliberately remind yourself, this sensation is force detection, not contact verification. You feel resistance and consciously think, forces are balancing. The recognition requires effort, but with repetition, it becomes spontaneous. Sit in a chair right now. Feel your body meeting the seat. The sensation screams, contact. But consciously recognize what's actually occurring. Forces in your body oppose forces in the chair's structure. Weight pushes downward. Attractive force acting on your mass. Resistance pushes upward. Repulsive force preventing interpenetration. Perfect equilibrium across imperceptible distance creates the sensation you interpret as sitting. The recognition requires bringing understanding to sensation deliberately, but practice this recognition repeatedly, and it begins arising automatically. Eventually, sitting down triggers immediate awareness, forces balancing to create stability across maintained distance. Knowledge becomes vision. Stand and walk across the room. Initially, walking feels like familiar contact, feet touching floor, stride after stride. But consciously recognize the mechanism. Each step transfers from one force, equilibrium, to another. Foot pushes backward, ground pushes forward with equal force, propelling you. Weight downward balances with resistance upward at each point. Walking is transition between balanced states, not contact between surfaces. Practice this recognition with each step. Feel the sensation. Identify the forces. Recognize the equilibrium. Repeated practice strengthens neural pathways until accurate interpretation becomes default, or pick up any object. Initially, the sensation feels like holding through contact, hand grasping, fingers touching, but recognize what's occurring. Forces in your hand surround the object at distance. Attractive force pulls it earthward. Your hand's repulsion prevents descent without contacting. Equilibrium suspends the object in space, held not through touching, but through balanced force across maintained gap. The more you practice conscious recognition, the more automatic it becomes. This is not pretending. This is not forcing yourself to believe something contrary to experience. This is training interpretation to align with mechanical truth. The sensation was always force detection. You were always misinterpreting it as contact. Now you correct the interpretation through repeated recognition. But understand, the sensation itself will never feel different. Touch will always feel like touching. This is important. Some people expect that true understanding will make sensations change, that if they really grasp the truth, the illusion would vanish. But sensation is determined by nervous system responses, not by conceptual understanding. Knowing the sun doesn't move doesn't make it appear stationary. Knowing the horizon is curved doesn't make it look curved from ground level. Knowing contact is impossible doesn't make touch feel like distance interaction. The sensation persists because it's generated by neurological mechanisms, not by beliefs. What changes is not sensation, but interpretation. You feel resistance and no longer automatically conclude contact. You feel pressure and recognize force equilibrium. You experience touch and identify balanced opposition across distance. The feeling remains, the meaning transforms. This distinction between expecting sensation to change and practicing interpretation until recognition is automatic is crucial for integration. If you expect feelings to change, you'll be disappointed and conclude you don't truly understand. But if you recognize that understanding changes interpretation while sensation continues, you can practice until interpretation aligns with truth. How long does this integration take? It varies. For some recognitions, weeks. For deeper integration, months. For complete transformation, where recognition arises spontaneously without deliberate attention, perhaps years. But the practice is not effort. It's simply noticing what's actually occurring during activities you already perform. Each conscious recognition strengthens the pathway from sensation to accurate interpretation. Initially, feeling resistance triggers old interpretation, contact, and you must consciously correct it. No, force is balancing. With repetition, feeling resistance begins triggering new interpretation directly. Force is balancing. Eventually, the old interpretation stops arising at all. You feel resistance and immediately recognize force equilibrium. The transformation is complete. The path from knowing to seeing requires patience and practice, but the practice is not burden. It's observation. It's paying attention to what's actually happening whilst engaging normally with the world. You don't need to constantly think about forces during ordinary activities. You simply notice them when attention turns to interactions. Each noticing reinforces accurate interpretation, and gradually understanding becomes integrated into perception itself. You no longer remember contact is impossible when touching things. You directly perceive force interaction. The translation from sensation to recognition becomes automatic. Knowledge has transformed into vision. Intellectual comprehension has become embodied wisdom. But one question remains, perhaps the most personal question of all. If you never touch anyone, what becomes of intimacy? Does understanding mechanism diminish human connection? Or does it reveal something more profound than the illusion ever suggested? Consider two people embracing. They feel warmth, pressure, closeness. The sensation is unmistakable. Bodies touching, contact creating connection. This experience feels so immediate, so profound, that suggesting no contact occurs seems to deny something essential about human intimacy. But examine what's actually happening during that embrace. Forces in one body repel forces in the other body, with strength proportional to proximity. As the two people draw closer together, forces begin interacting. The closer they approach, the more powerfully forces oppose interpenetration. Yet sensation reports touching. Sensation reports unity. Why? Because forces balance at distances so small they exceed perception. The gap is real. It persists, maintained by force, but immeasurably tiny. The separation exists in reality whilst vanishing into sensation. And this creates the experience you call intimacy. The mechanism doesn't prevent intimacy. The mechanism creates it. Closeness is not elimination of distance. Closeness is minimization of distance whilst maximizing force interaction. When you embrace someone, you bring forces so close that gaps seem to vanish. You compress distance to its smallest possible scale whilst forces maintain separation with corresponding power. The result is intense force interaction across imperceptible gap, and this interaction creates every sensation you associate with touching. The warmth you feel, partly body heat transferring through space, partly nervous system interpreting intense force interaction as meaningful sensation. The pressure, forces balanced in powerful opposition across minimal distance. The sense of contact, force interaction so powerful that your nervous system translates it as surfaces meeting. But no surfaces meet. Forces interact across distance maintained throughout. The intimacy is real. The mechanism is not what naive understanding imagined. Now consider, if contact were actually possible, if forces could interpenetrate, without resistance, what would occur during an embrace? Without repulsive forces creating resistance, bodies would pass through each other, without sensation. The touching you imagine would eliminate the force opposition that creates the sensation of contact. This reveals something profound. The impossibility of contact is precisely what makes the sensation possible. Distance maintained through force enables the experience you interpret as elimination of distance. The mechanism you might think prevents intimacy actually creates it. Your emotions don't require physical contact to be real. Love, connection, intimacy. These emerge from force interactions made meaningful through conscious interpretation. When you embrace someone you love, you experience powerful force interaction across minimal distance. Your consciousness interprets this experience as profound connection. And it is profound connection. The mechanism supports emotional significance fully. The gap between you and another person is not a barrier preventing union. It is the condition enabling interaction. Without distance, forces could not act in opposition. Without opposition, resistance could not arise. Without resistance, your nervous system would detect nothing. Sensation would fail. The very mechanism you might think prevents touching is what creates every sensation you treasure. Intimacy exists through forces brought to minimal distance, not despite the mechanism, but through it. The precision required for this is extraordinary. Forces must balance perfectly across imperceptible gap. Too much distance, and sensation weakens. Too much force trying to compress further, and discomfort or pain arises. But at optimal balance, force is powerful enough to create rich sensation, whilst distance small enough to seem absent. Intimacy emerges. This understanding doesn't diminish intimacy's meaning. If anything, it deepens appreciation. Every embrace demonstrates exquisite precision, forces approaching, distance minimizing, balance maintaining, sensation arising from mechanism operating according to universal principle. Your intimate connections participate in the same laws that govern planetary orbits and falling apples. This isn't reductive. This is magnificent. The person you embrace is structure maintained by forces across internal distances. You are structure approaching structure. When you draw close, forces in your structure interact with forces in their structure. The interaction occurs across maintained distance, and this interaction, precise, powerful, governed by cosmic law, creates every sensation of warmth, pressure, closeness. The emotion you feel is interpretation of this interaction. But interpretation is not illusion. Meaning is not false. When you embrace someone you love, the love is real. The connection is real. The profound significance is real. All of it emerges from force interaction, made meaningful through conscious awareness. You might think, if it's just forces, it's not really connection. But forces interacting precisely create every sensation you value. What you call connection has always been force interaction. Understanding the mechanism doesn't erase the meaning. It reveals that meaning never required the impossible. Contact would not be more real than force across distance. Contact is impossible. But if it were possible, it would eliminate the very mechanism that creates sensation. What seems like second best, interaction through distance rather than through touching, is actually the only mechanism capable of generating the experiences you treasure. Hold someone's hand right now, if possible. Feel that sensation. Recognize forces in your hand interact with forces in theirs across infinitesimal distance. The warmth, the pressure, the sense of connection all emerge from force equilibrium maintained with exquisite precision. The gap persists. The connection is profound. These are not contradictory truths. They are complementary aspects of the same reality. Your recognition of mechanism doesn't diminish the experience. You still feel warmth. You still feel connection. You still experience intimacy. But now you understand what creates these sensations. And understanding reveals something more beautiful than naive assumptions suggested, that forces acting according to universal law can create experiences so meaningful, so profound, so emotionally significant, that consciousness interprets them as touching souls. Intimacy survives understanding. It flourishes with it. Because intimacy was never elimination of distance. Intimacy was always forces brought close. Connection was always interaction across maintained separation. And recognizing this truth doesn't diminish human experience. It reveals human experience as participation in cosmic principle. Forces in exquisite balance, creating every moment of closeness, every sensation of touching, every experience of profound connection. You don't lose intimacy by understanding mechanism. You recognize what intimacy actually is, and you discover it's more magnificent than the illusion ever suggested. But one final question remains. What does it mean to live with this understanding permanently? How does this knowledge change your relationship with existence itself? You cannot unknow what you now understand. Contact is impossible. You will never touch anything. Not in the future. Not through effort. Not through wishing. The boundary is absolute. The separation is permanent. The gap will persist every moment of your existence. This is not tragedy. This is truth. And truth, however different from childhood assumptions, liberates rather than imprisons. You move through the world differently when you recognize you never touch it. Not sadly, not with loss, but with wonder at the precision enabling every interaction. You stand on forces balanced to prevent interpenetration. You hold objects through surrounding repulsion. You navigate reality through equilibrium maintained across distance. This understanding doesn't alienate you from the world. It reveals how you've always been interacting with it. The solid world was illusion. The truth is more magnificent. Forces in perpetual interaction, creating every structure, every stability, every sensation through distance maintained with perfect precision. Walk across a room right now with full recognition active. Each step, weight downward, resistance upward, forces balanced, creating stability at infinitesimal distance. Your foot never touches floor, never has, never will. Forces create equilibrium, transferring from point to point as you move. The ground doesn't support you through contact. Forces in the ground's structure oppose forces in your foot's structure with precisely the strength needed to prevent interpenetration whilst maintaining your position. The balance is perfect. The distance is imperceptible. The mechanism operates continuously without your conscious attention. Pick up any object. Forces in your hand surround it at distance, preventing descent without contacting. Attractive force pulls it earthward. Your hand's repulsion prevents its response to attraction. Equilibrium suspends the object in space, held not through touching, but through balanced force across maintained gap. Set it down. Attractive force pulls it toward a surface. Repulsive force arises as proximity increases. Forces meet. They balance. Equilibrium is established across imperceptible gap. The object comes to rest through force equilibrium, not through contact. This is what happens. This is what's always happened. You simply never recognized it. Every moment reveals forces acting according to universal principle. You navigate reality through mechanism you now understand. This is life lived in truth rather than comfortable illusion. And living in truth generates wonder more reliably than pleasant falsehoods ever could, because the precision required for every interaction is genuinely magnificent. Forces balancing perfectly across imperceptible distances, structures maintained through perpetual equilibrium, every step demonstrating cosmic law in operation, every interaction participating in principles that govern planets and atoms alike. This isn't forced appreciation. This is natural response to recognizing how reality actually operates. The solid world was mundane, surfaces touching, objects bumping, nothing extraordinary about ordinary experience. But the truth is extraordinary. Fields of force in perpetual interaction, creating every sensation through exquisite balance, maintaining every structure through precise opposition. You exist as structure held stable through perpetual balanced opposition. Configuration, maintained by forces across internal distances. Every moment of your existence depends on forces acting according to principle you now understand. You are not solid substance moving through empty space. You are configuration of forces interacting with other configurations through maintained distances. This recognition transforms what it means to exist physically. You are pattern. You are relationship. You are forces in balance, creating stable form. And you navigate through a universe operating by the same principle. Force across distance, creating every phenomenon from intimate to cosmic. You don't need to constantly think about forces during ordinary activities. Understanding becomes background awareness, present without demanding attention. Like knowing Earth rotates whilst focusing on daily tasks. Like knowing blood circulates whilst engaging in conversation. The understanding informs perception without dominating consciousness. But when attention turns to interaction, when you notice yourself sitting or walking or holding something, recognition arises spontaneously. You don't think, I must remember forces are acting. You directly perceive force equilibrium. The translation from sensation to accurate interpretation has become automatic. This integration cannot be rushed. It requires time. Weeks become months. Months might become years for complete transformation where recognition arises effortlessly without deliberate attention. But the practice is not burden. It's simply noticing what's actually occurring during activities you already perform. Each conscious recognition strengthens neural pathways until accurate interpretation becomes default. Initially, you must remind yourself, not touching, forces balancing. With repetition, the reminder becomes unnecessary. Feeling resistance triggers immediate recognition of force equilibrium. Knowledge has transformed into vision. Understanding has become direct perception. And this perception is not burden, but gift. You haven't lost the ability to interact with the world. You've gained understanding of how you've always been interacting with it. The sensation remains unchanged. The meaning has deepened. You move through existence knowing you touch nothing, yet interact with everything completely. This is not alienation. This is clarity. This is seeing reality as it actually is, rather than as childhood assumptions suggested. And reality revealed is more wondrous than reality concealed. The journey is complete. You began believing you could touch things. You were wrong. But now you understand not just that you were wrong, you understand why. You understand what's actually occurring every moment. Every sensation you interpreted as contact was force meeting force across invisible distance. Every moment of resistance was balanced opposition, maintaining imperceptible gap. Every instance of support was equilibrium, created by forces in perfect proportion. You moved through life separated from everything you believed yourself to touch, not by vast emptiness, but by forces in such exquisite balance that distance seemed to vanish. This gap cannot be eliminated. It is not limitation to overcome, but fundamental condition of existence. Without it, forces cannot act in opposition. Without opposition, structure cannot maintain itself. Without structure, matter as you experience it cannot exist. The separation you've discovered isn't flaw in reality. It's the mechanism making reality possible. You will never touch anything. The boundary is absolute. But this isn't cause for despair. This is revelation of how the universe actually operates. You interact completely through forces acting across distance. You hold objects not through contact, but through surrounding repulsion. You stand not upon surfaces, but upon balanced opposition. You embrace not through touching, but through forces brought so close that gaps seem to disappear. The gap doesn't disappear. It cannot disappear. It is maintained by the very forces that create the sensation of its absence. This is the truth beneath every interaction you will ever experience. Forces act, opposites balance, distance persists, and through this mechanism, not despite it, you navigate reality with complete precision. The solid world was always illusion created by forces in perfect opposition. What you thought was contact was always distance interaction made so precise it fooled sensation. But sensation is not reality. Sensation is merely force translated into feeling. Now you understand what you're actually feeling, not contact, never contact. Force preventing contact at distances so small they defy imagination. This is what happens when you try to touch anything. This is what's been happening your entire life. And now you know. You see through the illusion to the mechanism. You recognize the principle operating in every moment. You understand the truth that remained hidden beneath obvious assumptions. You move through existence knowing you touch nothing, yet you interact with everything. The universe operates through forces across distance, and you, structure maintained by those same forces, participate in cosmic law every moment. This is not the end of understanding. This is its beginning. The ocean of truth stretches infinite before you, but you've found something more than a pebble on the shore. You've grasped a principle that illuminates everything. The world has not changed. Your perception of it has. And perception transformed by truth is more magnificent than comfortable ignorance ever was. You will never touch anything, but you will interact with everything through forces across distance. According to law, this is reality. This is truth. And truth, however different from assumption, is what makes wisdom possible.